Well, you never know. I mean, there's just as bad things as it.
She was the face that launched 1,000 runways, but behind the camera flash, she was spiraling into the dark. At just 18, Gia Carangi wasn't walking into fashion, she was crashing into it like a hurricane. She had the rawness of punk, the elegance of a swan, and the unfiltered attitude of someone who didn't care what the industry thought, and that's exactly why they loved her. In an era obsessed with polished perfection, Gia brought chaos, danger, and desire. She didn't pose, she possessed the frame. Her presence wasn't styled, it stormed through editorials from Vogue to Cosmopolitan. Photographers described her as wild and electric, unpredictable, yet intoxicating. And just like that, the industry crowned her the first supermodel of the 1980s. But while Gia was becoming fashion's obsession, she was also becoming her own worst enemy. By 26, she was dead. How does someone rise so fast and vanish even faster? How did the woman who once draped herself across glossy pages, adored by Versace and Scavullo, end up addicted, isolated, and forgotten? Today, we rewind the reel to uncover the haunting rise and devastating fall of Gia Carangi, the woman who lit the fire for every supermodel who came after her but was herself consumed by it. Let's begin. Gia Marie Carangi was born on January 29, 1960 in Philadelphia, not in the glamorous spotlight of New York or Los Angeles, but in a working-class neighborhood where the American dream felt more like an unreachable billboard than a living reality. Her father, Joe Carangi, owned a small hoagie shop. Her mother, Kathleen, was a homemaker with aspirations far beyond domestic life. Their marriage, though, was anything but peaceful. From an early age, Gia was surrounded by volatility. Her mother was known to be distant and emotionally unstable, and when Gia was just 11, Kathleen abruptly left the family, abandoning her daughter without explanation. That moment would etch a lifelong scar. Gia, already sensitive and searching for security, was suddenly motherless and desperate for love. She became a teenager defined by longing. She idolized David Bowie not just for his music, but for his androgynous style and aura of misfit power. Gia, too, was different. She didn't fit the suburban mold. She hung out with older kids, drifted into punk circles, and started experimenting with drugs early. Her friends called themselves the Bowie Kids Rebels, who painted their faces and haunted late-night diners, trying to turn suburban numbness into something electric. Despite the chaos, Gia had a magnetic presence. At school, she was aloof but captivating. Tall, lean, with thick, dark eyebrows and a full mouth, she wasn't traditionally pretty, but she was impossible to ignore. Some called her moody, others intense, but no one could deny she had something. That something caught the attention of a local photographer when she was just 17. But Gia didn't dream of runways or fashion. In fact, she barely saw herself as beautiful. Modelling seemed like a fluke, not a path. Still, with little else holding her in Philadelphia, no stable family, no ambitions for college, she took the chance. What Gia didn't know then was that she was already wired for self-destruction. The wounds from her fractured home, the abandonment, the instability, the hunger for validation would travel with her silently into every dressing room and behind every camera lens. They wouldn't stop when the flashbulbs did. And yet, in those early days, Gia believed she was leaving her pain behind. Moving to New York meant reinvention. It meant possibility. It meant the illusion of freedom. But sometimes escaping one fire only means running into another. Gia arrived in New York at 18, no agency, no experience, just a few snapshots and a volatile energy that felt equal parts thrilling and dangerous. She wasn't polished. She didn't walk into modelling like a trained dancer. She stumbled in like a rock star looking for a stage. But that's exactly what fashion didn't know it needed. Her first real break came through Wilhelmina Cooper, the legendary model-turned-agent, who saw in Gia something she hadn't seen in years. Authenticity. Wilhelmina didn't just take her on, she believed in her. Where other girls were molded, Gia was left raw. And it worked. Within weeks, she was landing editorials. Within months, she was the face of campaigns. Her look, fierce, feline, unfiltered, was a sharp left turn from the blonde Barbie-like models dominating the late 70s. Photographers like Francesco Scavullo, Chris von Wangenheim, and Arthur Elgort fought to shoot her. They said she didn't just pose, she transformed. She didn't understand lighting angles or fashion theory, but when the camera turned on, Gia lit up. She was instinctual, magnetic, a wild card that made every photo feel like a risk worth taking. But there was something else about Gia that made her rise even more radical. She was openly queer in an era where most models hid behind manufactured relationships. Gia didn't play along. She flirted with women, kissed her girlfriends at parties, and brought a sensuality to her work that felt provocatively real. She didn't perform desire, she owned it, and in a male-dominated industry that made her both a fascination and a threat. Still, her fame escalated fast. Vogue Harper's bizarre Cosmopolitan by 1980 Gia was on their covers. She worked with Versace, Armani, and Diane von Furstenberg. Fashion Week's runways, backstage chaos. Gia was everywhere. She wasn't just booked, she was demanded. But behind the scenes, the signs were already there. She struggled with punctuality. She would disappear for days. Her moods shifted unpredictably. Her charm could turn to confrontation without warning. And worst of all, she was beginning to self-medicate. What started with weed and pills became something darker. Heroin crept in slowly, but once it took hold, it became her lover, her secret, her escape. Still, in those first few years, the industry turned a blind eye. Gia was profitable, Gia was electric, and for a brief, intoxicating moment, it felt like she might rewrite what it meant to be a model. She wasn't the silent mannequin, she was the rebel in silk, the outsider turned insider, the girl from Philly who never finished high school, now dining with Halston and partying with Andy Warhol. But Gia was also still the little girl looking for her mother, and now she had found something just as seductive, just as dangerous, and just as likely to vanish. The world was watching Gia rise. None of them were prepared for how quickly she would fall. By 1980, Gia Carangi was more than a model, she was a movement. Her name echoed through the corridors of fashion houses in Milan, Paris, and New York. Designers didn't just want her, they needed her. She had become the embodiment of something raw, new, and unrepeatable. A face that didn't conform, a body that didn't apologize, and a presence that couldn't be trained. She was everywhere. Magazine racks were filled with her image, cover after cover, Vogue, Cosmopolitan, Harper's Bazaar. Her face was sold alongside Maybelline, Versace, Christian Dior, and Levi's. In an industry where the spotlight was fleeting, Gia wasn't just surviving, she was dominating. Her work with photographer Francesco Scavullo became legendary. Scavullo described her as one of the most naturally gifted models he had ever seen. A chameleon who could flip from innocent to provocative in the space of a single frame. She didn't need direction. She felt the camera. There were no rehearsed poses. She simply arrived and the lens surrendered. One of her most iconic shoots was for Vogue in 1980, where Gia appeared barefaced, wrapped in only a sheer scarf, her eyes smouldering with defiance. That image, vulnerable, intimate, and rebellious, became a cultural reset. It shattered the illusion that models had to be flawless and docile. Gia wasn't selling perfection, she was selling pain, beauty, danger, and desire all in one breath. Backstage, she was the girl everyone whispered about. She'd walk in late, sometimes, glassy-eyed, sometimes radiant, always unpredictable. She could make a room fall silent with a glance or burst into laughter with a cigarette joke. Models wanted to be her, photographers wanted to capture her, stylists scrambled to dress her, but no one could contain her. And that was the problem. Because even as she soared, Gia was slipping. The heroine, once occasional, had become constant. It dulled her edges. It numbed the noise. But it also began to show. On sets, her arms were often hidden under long sleeves. Makeup artists were instructed to cover up bruises. There were whispers too thin, too erratic, too risky. But Gia was still Gia. And in the industry's eyes, that still meant money. Her modelling fees skyrocketed. She walked the most exclusive runways. She flew on private jets. She spent nights at Studio 54 dancing with rock stars, kissing strangers, losing herself in neon and bass. But as the parties grew wilder, her behaviour became harder to ignore. Photographers started cancelling shoots, clients hesitated. Rumours of rehab began circulating, but Gia, fierce as ever, refused to admit she was spiralling. In one now infamous shoot, she arrived hours late, visibly high, and still managed to deliver a photo that would land on the cover of Vogue. It was a high-wire act, and she was running out of wire. Still, the industry clung to her, because Gia wasn't just a pretty face, she had shifted the axis. She helped usher in a new era of modelling where attitude mattered more than symmetry, where the image was no longer just about clothes, but about feeling. She paved the way for what would later be called the supermodel, a term not yet in full swing, but already moulded in her shadow. Cindy, Linda, Naomi, they would all come after. But Gia was first, and being first in this business often means being sacrificed. Gia Carangi didn't just model clothes, she disrupted the culture that sold them. In an industry polished to the point of sterility, Gia was messy, loud, unpredictable, and real. Her existence was a rejection of every norm fashion tried to enforce. She was openly queer in a business that demanded heteronormativity. While most models played the game of straight relationships and coded interviews, Gia kissed her girlfriends in public, brought lovers to sets, and refused to explain herself. When asked about her sexuality, she simply said, "I like who I like." That was her brand of defiance, not loud, but absolute. Her femininity, too, was a rebellion. Gia didn't wear sweetness like a costume. She had a masculine energy, a street edge, a toughness that came not from styling, but survival. She could be sensual and confrontational in the same breath. 1 minute, she was draped in chiffon for Vogue. The next, she was flipping off photographers backstage. She didn't smile for the sake of the shot. She scowled, smirked, seduced. And it worked, because Gia's appeal wasn't about beauty. It was about presence. Even her drug use, though destructive, was a silent rebellion. The industry demanded compliance: be pretty, be thin, be available, and above all, be quiet. Gia didn't comply. She self-medicated loudly. She showed up late, eyes, clouded veins, bruised, forcing the industry to confront what it usually hid. Heroin wasn't glamorous, but Gia made even her unravelling look iconic. That contradiction made her dangerous and unforgettable. In photo shoots, she broke the fourth wall. She stared into the camera like she knew it was complicit in something bigger. She didn't play muse, she challenged the gaze. That's what separated her from the catalogue girls, the pageant beauties. Gia wasn't there to decorate. She was there to dominate. She clashed with stylists, rejected fittings, and often insisted on her own clothes or looks. She hated being moulded, hated being managed. Even her walk loose, lazy, almost careless was an affront to the militarised runways of the time. She didn't walk like she was told to. She walked like she owned it. And she paid the price. Fashion is a machine that devours the very people it praises. Gia's refusal to obey made her iconic, but it also made her expendable. By 1982, the bookings slowed. Rumours of her drug use made clients nervous. Her erratic behaviour, once framed as charm, was now called a liability. She was in the industry's eyes too difficult. But to the people who saw past the gloss, Gia was a prophet of a new era. She proved that modelling wasn't just about being looked at, it was about saying something, even if it was just, "I'm not playing your game." She didn't just break the rules. She refused to believe they ever applied to her, and in doing so, Gia carved a path, brutal, brilliant, and burning for every outsider who would one day dare to walk a runway on their own terms. The fall of Gia Carangi wasn't a sudden collapse, it was a slow-motion tragedy, and everyone saw it coming. By 1982, the magic was cracking. Heroin wasn't just a vice anymore, it was a necessity. Her arms bore the marks, her eyes lost their spark. She still booked occasional shoots, but the unpredictability was too great. She would nod off mid-session. She once fell asleep on set with a needle still in her arm. Stylists whispered. Editors stopped calling. Even Scavullo, once her biggest champion, began to back away. She entered rehab that year, but it wasn't her decision, it was an ultimatum. Wilhelmina had passed away suddenly in 1980, and without her, Gia was adrift. Her new agency didn't coddle her, the industry had moved on. Her name, once a guarantee, now came with risk. Rehab helped, but it didn't save her. Gia got out, stayed clean for a moment, and then drifted back into the same circles, same parties, same dealers, same spiral. In 1983, she tried to return. A shoot with Scavullo for Cosmopolitan was arranged a last chance, but the photos tell the story. Gia, once fierce and untouchable, looked vacant. Her hair was thinner, her body frail. The fire was flickering. It would be her final cover. After that, Gia disappeared from the public eye. She moved back to Philadelphia. She tried to find normalcy, worked briefly at a clothing store, a cafeteria, even tried enrolling in photography school. But nothing stuck. She was restless. Lost. No longer Gia the supermodel, just Gia, the girl who had once been famous. And fame once gone leaves a silence that's almost unbearable. She drifted back to drugs. This time the descent was steeper. By 1984, she was in and out of methadone clinics, arrested for possession, hospitalized for infections. Her beauty had faded, not from age, but from neglect. She became a ghost in her own city. People whispered when they saw her. Some didn't recognize her at all. Then came the final cruel twist. In December 1985, Gia was admitted to a hospital with pneumonia, but tests revealed something worse. She had contracted AIDS. It was the early days of the epidemic. The diagnosis was a death sentence. And for Gia, who had already been discarded by the fashion world, there would be no media coverage, no awareness campaign, no high-profile support. She spent her final months in a hospital room alone, visited only by her mother. The same mother who had abandoned her now watched her daughter waste away. Gia's once famous body, the one that graced Versace campaigns and Vogue covers, was now withering from the inside out. She died on November 18, 1986. She was 26. There was no industry tribute. No front-page obituary. Her death was quiet, ignored, buried like the stigma of AIDS itself. Gia became one of the first famous women to die from the disease, yet her story was hushed. In an industry that had once adored her chaos, no one wanted to acknowledge her end, but the silence said everything. Gia had broken their rules, refused their boxes, exposed their hypocrisy, and for that, she was erased. Her fall wasn't just about drugs, it was about what happens when a woman refuses to be tamed and the world punishes her for it. Gia Carangi vanished long before the world knew how to remember her, but time, as it often does, has softened the noise and sharpened the truth. In the decades since her death, Gia has become a symbol of beauty, rebellion, and brutal honesty. She is now widely recognized as the first supermodel, not just for her magazine covers or runway strides, but because she changed what modelling meant. She proved that it wasn't about perfection, it was about power, about emotion, about daring to be seen even when the truth was ugly. Her story inspired books, documentaries, and most famously the 1998 HBO film Gia, starring Angelina Jolie, a performance that introduced her to a new generation and cemented her legacy as more than just a tragic figure. She became a warning and a muse, a myth and a mirror. But perhaps Gia's greatest legacy is this: she made space for queer models, for broken girls, for women who didn't fit the mold and didn't want to. She didn't survive her fame, but she cracked the walls so others could walk through. Today, her face is rarely seen in store windows. Her name isn't taught in fashion schools. But for those who know, really know, Gia Carangi isn't forgotten. She is the girl who burned too bright, too fast, and too true. And maybe that's the only way someone like her